Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, what does the U.S.-Israeli war in Iran look like from China?
With missiles and drones flying in all directions in the Gulf, many fear the fragile truce between Beijing and Washington will crack.
With Donald Trump expected to visit China in the coming weeks, how will this war affect an increasingly fraught U.S.-China relationship? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. Hey everyone. As you're watching today's episode on The View from China, let us know the impact this war is having on the place where you live. Leave your comment below and join the discussion. If you're listening to this on a podcast app, rate and review us. 5 stars makes it easier for other people to find the show. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Katrina Yu. I am the Al Jazeera English correspondent based here in Beijing.
Katrina, it is really nice to have you back on The Take. The U.S. and Israeli war in Iran has now been going on for nearly 2 full weeks. You are based in Beijing, China, as you said, which is a key ally of Iran, and before the war, the biggest buyer of its oil. So what does the war look like from your vantage point?
Well, China's been one of the loudest critics of the U.S. and Israel and its war on Iran. China has condemned the assassination of Iran's leaders. It said that it's unacceptable that these attacks were launched when there were negotiations underway. We've had pretty strong words coming out of Chinese government officials. They said that the Middle East is being pushed to the brink of a dangerous abyss, which for Chinese officials, that's pretty strong language. And they've called for an immediate de-escalation, a ceasefire, and they want things to return to talks. They want negotiations to restart. China, of course, is also trying to take care of its own interests, namely its energy interests and the huge shortfall in imports. It's now probably no longer getting from the Gulf states. About 40% of all of its imported crude oil comes through that region, through the Strait of Hormuz. So domestically, we've seen China take some actions, like it's ordered all of its refiners to halt any exports of gasoline and diesel, trying to hoard as much fuel as possible at home. It's lifted its price caps on petrol to its highest point in 4 years. And there have also been reports that China is using or trying to use its good standing or its influence with Iran to try to pressure Iranian officials to continue to allow Chinese ships to pass through the Strait of Hormuz.
Interesting. Okay. So this strait being closed effectively to ships going to and from, and thus getting China the oil that it needs, what has that meant for people? Have they felt an impact yet?
Well, on Tuesday morning, people would have woken up to higher prices at petrol stations. And that increase would have been about 8% nationwide. So that, I think, has been the biggest impact. China has about 100 days of stockpile of crude oil. So there are still strategic reserves that it hasn't had to dip into yet. China has been trying to diversify its oil imports. So beyond that price increase and the volatility in stock prices, I think the everyday person may not be feeling the impact of the war yet, but certainly it's already starting to impact manufacturing. I mean, there's so many petrochemicals and other things that come from the Gulf, and there have already been some petrochemical companies in China that have been forced to suspend their operations because of a lack or a fear of a lack of supply coming from that region.
And yet, brink of the abyss, those are really strong words. So let's talk about what might be happening diplomatically, because as we know, China's government has condemned the U.S. and Israeli actions in Iran. But other than these strongly worded statements, it seems most of what's happening, if it's happening diplomatically, must be taking place behind the scenes. So what can you tell us? What do you know?
That's right. So China has dispatched its special envoy to the Middle East, Jun, to the region, and his job is purely to continue to push for a ceasefire, for de-escalation. We know that China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has been feverishly making calls to his foreign minister counterparts in the Gulf region and around the world. I think this is very much China's style, back-channel diplomacy, trying to achieve, I think, above all, the goal is a return to stability. That's what China wants to see, a de-escalation. It's worried about this being a war without end and the impact this will have not only on China and China's economy, but the global economy.
So those are the potential negative impacts. I wonder, and it feels wrong to say, but could there be an upside? Because over the last few years, we have seen Chinese influence, especially with the building of infrastructure and the strengthening of economic ties, grow steadily across the Middle East. And so I wonder if there's a sense that the U.S.'s actions will just push countries in the region closer to China.
I think certainly there is a kind of geopolitical strategic upside, and that is we've heard from officials for years now communicate this message that the U.S. equals global instability while China equals stability, a reliable, predictable partner, doesn't attach political strings to its cooperation, it's non-interventionist vis-a-vis the West, or vis-a-vis the U.S. in particular. China is proud of this, although, of course, many people would argue with that portrayal, that Beijing, that description of Beijing as being a non-interventionist state. So I think certainly this war being so shockingly launched by the U.S. and Israel gives some sort of credence, I guess, to that narrative, or at least strengthens that narrative or that propaganda coming from Beijing. You're right to say that China has been investing in the Middle East region with Gulf states for decades now. It's been building up, especially those economic ties. It has been working to invest in infrastructure and energy deals. Obviously, it works with these Gulf states through its Belt and Road Infrastructure project. China meets regularly with Gulf states and this big summit that it hosts. So China has been trying to build up its economic ties, but also its influence in that region. And I think certainly there would be a sense that these Gulf states respect what China has to offer. But it is a mixed picture. I don't think it's a straightforward, well, this makes the U.S. look bad and therefore China gains. Because I think one thing that the Gulf states understand is that while China is a reliable and beneficial economic partner, it cannot provide the kind of security guarantees or the security benefits that these Gulf states get from the United States. So I think there is some upside here for China in that sense, but I don't know if there are any direct diplomatic gains. I think one thing that China does get is that if this becomes another protracted war that the U.S. finds itself entangled in the Middle East, that means that it may have fewer resources to devote to, say, the Asia Pacific. It may have fewer resources and time and energy to look at what China is doing. So for that would be definitely a positive thing for China.
I'll be back with Katrina after the break. Well, Katrina, U.S. officials have given many competing reasons for the launch of this war, but countering the world's other superpower, i.e. China, has not been one of them, at least explicitly. And yet China, after the countries that are actually being dragged into the fighting, may be the place that is most affected. Is there something that might trigger a stronger response from China beyond just these statements?
Well, I mean, China is definitely affected. It's the world's largest buyer of crude oil. So those prices going up at a time when China's economy is slowing, that's not good news for Beijing. China is so reliant on that region for its oil imports. So China is definitely affected. But again, I think it's not really China's style to intervene materially or militarily in these kind of conflicts. I think it's really most likely to continue working diplomatically through back channels to try to achieve some sort of stability, to get things to de-escalate, return to diplomacy. That being said, though, I think China has very clear red lines. If somehow this affected China's security directly, or this conflict dragged on to the extent that it puts China really in a desperate situation in terms of its energy, then China may be forced to act. But I think the chances of China intervening militarily at some point is still pretty low at this stage.
Mm. How much of this do you think will come up during this summit between U.S. President Donald Trump and China's Xi Jinping, which is, in a short time from now? It's a huge event. Could this derail the plans of this summit, or is it likely to feature at all?
Yeah, huge event. We're all preparing for it. I am looking forward to it, but also not looking forward to the city coming to a standstill, basically, because of Donald Trump being in town. I think this disagreement over the war in Iran is basically another thing added to the very long list of things that Washington and Beijing disagree about. And it is definitely something that complicates that meeting. It's another source of tension. And right now, Beijing and Washington, I think there is some genuine will towards stabilizing that relationship, and a lot at stake for both sides to deliver some positive outcomes or some progress from that meeting. So this doesn't help that case. But at the same time, it also, in a way, puts more onus on both sides to appear more stable, to take that relationship to a better place, because nobody wants to see the relationship between the two biggest superpowers in the world spiral, in a negative way while all of this is unfolding in Iran. So I think it does put extra pressure on both sides. I think China has been also very careful in all its condemnation not to do anything that would directly offend Donald Trump. I think it could have used stronger language, but I think it's also very much keeping an eye on that summit and its own goals and deliverables that it wants to see out of that meeting.
So for you as a journalist, is your focus, is it feeling pretty split right now? Because we have this last minute summit plan with all of the hurried, frenzied preparations that go into it. You mentioned Beijing will come to a standstill. And this is supposed to be about trade talks and tariffs and economic ties. And yet we have this war looming in the background that is increasingly getting larger and larger. How are you maneuvering all of that?
The question I'm getting all the time right now is this still actually happening? I mean, this is Donald Trump that we're talking about, right? So he's not actually known for his predictability. And I think if it actually happens, I think we'll all be pleasantly surprised. I mean, there is still a chance that this Iran conflict could escalate to the extent that he has to cancel his trip. So that's one thing. But I think we're all just basically, it makes it very difficult to plan because we don't know where we will be in this conflict at that point. Is it even still going to be continuing? Nobody seems to know, including Donald Trump and his own officials. So it's very much going to be, I think we're going to see what happens in the days, even hours leading up to it, to see how to best cover this thing. But I think China, I've been reading also, is getting quite frustrated by the frenzy atmosphere and the lack of detail and planning in the leading up to this, because China, out of all the countries in the world, loves to have things really put in concrete way ahead of time, predictable, reliable. So I think Chinese officials, more than journalists, are pretty frustrated right now.
Okay, so we've talked about Chinese government officials and what might be happening diplomatically behind the scenes. What about the people? What about intellectuals, public figures, man on the street? What are they thinking?
I think intellectuals or state media, the line has very much been, this is just another example of U.S. hegemonic power imposing its will unilaterally on a vulnerable country without the permission or approval of the international community. That's the official line. I was surprised to read on the embassy webpage of Iran, or some social media web pages here in China, some people posting comments of support, because unlike in the West, China portrays Iran and other countries that are considered pariah states by the West, such as Venezuela or Cuba. It portrays these countries as friendly countries, as important partners of China. So there are many people here who are rooting for Iran and the Iranian regime, who see the attacks as very unfair. And so a lot of support also. But of course, it's a mixed bag. There are also people who are fans of Trump in a very superficial way, and also kind of amused and rooting for seeing more U.S. firepower. One thing that I think is interesting is that China has been working for decades to reshape the world in the way that it would like to see. And it wants to see a more multipolar world, one where the U.S. has less power and less influence. And I think specifically Beijing is befriending countries considered pariahs by the U.S., like Iran, like North Korea, like Venezuela, because it sees those countries as important partners and counterweights to U.S. influence in the global stage. And I think what we have seen in the last few weeks, not just with Iran, but also with Venezuela, is that those players on the Chinese side of the chessboard have been taken out or are in the process of being taken out. And I think that I would be surprised if that doesn't ring alarm bells for China. I think China certainly saw Iran as a country that was a counterweight to the U.S. And should the regime fall, that may not necessarily be in China's interest. That could reshape alliances in the region in a way that doesn't favor China, in a way that favors the U.S.
Well, finally, Katrina, in many ways, this conflict isn't something that perhaps surprised China. You referenced this earlier, that they have been warning for years about the instability of the United States. So is this something that you think they've planned for in a way?
I am sure there are one or two officials or a team of officials for who this conflict in the Middle East is their worst nightmare and the thing that they have spent decades planning for. I think the upside for China is that the China of today is not the China of 20 years ago. If this whole thing happened 20 years ago, while China was far more vulnerable in terms of its energy needs to this kind of conflicts, I think that would have been an extremely dire situation for Beijing. But right now, if you look back at what China has been doing for the past few decades, it's been working very hard to, one, diversify its sources of energy, oil and LNG. It also looks to countries like Russia, Brazil even, Kazakhstan, places it can get its oil without having to go through that choke point of the Strait of Hormuz. So it's been working to build up those partners specifically for that reason. And also China, more than any other country, has been investing in renewable energy, trying to wean itself off fossil fuels. I was updating myself on some of these statistics. Renewable sources make up 20% of all China's energy needs. 1 in 2 vehicles that are purchased today are electric. And that's not just passenger vehicles. That's electric trucks, electric buses. So this whole time, we thought that China was heavily invested in a climate change policy, but really it was a national security energy policy that they've been investing in this whole time to precisely try to prepare itself for situations like this. And it's not done. Of course, it still relies on that energy. But I think scenarios like this are exactly while China has been trying to move in that direction. And it's been putting itself in a better position. What we've been hearing from Chinese officials time and time again in recent years is that China finds itself in an increasingly unpredictable, tense external environment. And the solution for Beijing officials is to become more self-reliant in every area where it comes to, from the economy to energy. And I think this is what China has been trying to do. It's not quite there yet. And so it is still vulnerable, but it's still far less exposed than it would have been years ago.
Katrina, thank you for walking us through this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Malika. It's always lovely to speak to you.